Hello and welcome to Music Theory with Matthew. We have reached the end. We're at the end of the row. This is session number 6, the last one. So thank you so much for tuning in and joining us. We've been discussing plans to maybe do some more of this in the future. So stay tuned for information about that. But I won't talk too much. I'll just turn this over to Matthew and we'll get going on this last little bit of our music theory journey.
All right, thank you very much, Rachel. Is screen sharing enabled today? No.
Yes.
Thank you. All right. So, as we mentioned, we are at the last day. Gonna talk about 2 musical forms that are pretty much the most common musical forms of the classical period, or among the most common. Just a little bit of a recap and review of what we did last time. We talked about modulations. Last session's unit was modulations, where we go from one key to another using a variety of different techniques. And as I mentioned, the most common technique, the common chord modulation. I put this progression up, and as you can see, we start in the key of C, we end in the key of F, and we use this chord right here. It's a D minor chord to modulate between C and F. D minor is the 2 chord in the key of C. It is the 6 chord in the key of F. It is a common chord to both keys, and we use it to pivot from one key to another. We call it the pivot chord. So we start in C. Here's our pivot chord, D minor, and from here we're in F. It is the smoothest way to modulate and also the most common that you will see in classical music. Next, we talked about the common tone modulation, where one note is common between 2 keys, and you use that note. You have a chord in the previous key, you drop the rest of the notes out, you hold only the common tone, and then you come in with the rest of the notes of the new key. I have Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, 3rd movement. We start in the key of B flat major. We're going to D flat major, and F is our common tone between those 2 keys. Sounded like this. So F holds over. We finish on an F major triad, the 5 chord of B flat. F holds over, and we go to D flat major. Lovely way to modulate. Less common, but it always creates a beautiful moment when it happens. Finally, the direct modulation, where you simply go from one key to another with no preparation whatsoever. We looked at Beethoven Sonata number 5 in C minor, has 2 direct modulations. Starting right where the blue arrow is pointing, we're in the key of A flat major. Sorry, I'm going to start that over. Direct to F minor. Finally, direct to D flat major. So there you have it, our 3 types of modulations that most frequently occur in classical music. We also talked about the chord progression flowchart for minor keys. It's very similar to the one for major keys, except that whether a chord in the flowchart is major or minor, or diminished or not, is different in a minor key. So for instance, our tonic And our 4 chord, which were major in a major key, are now minor. Our 2 chord, which was minor, is now diminished in a minor key. And our 3 and 6 chords, which were minor in a major key, are now major in the minor key. 5 and 7 typically are still major and diminished, respectively, because they are the last step in the flowchart that leads us back to 1. So we still get the same 5-1 sound. But you can occasionally have 7 be a major triad, and it would go at the very beginning of the flowchart before 3 if it occurs. We then moved on to begin to start talking about musical form. And we started with the ABA form, ternary form, 2 A sections that are the same on the outside, and in the middle, a contrasting B section. We looked at Hello Mudda, Hello Fada, based on Amilcare Ponchielli's Dance of the Hours as our example of ternary form. We then looked at scherzo form, which is a type of ternary form where we have our big ABA, scherzo is our A section, trio is our B, and then a return of the scherzo is our A. But in each large section of the ternary form, we have a mini ABA as well. So that's scherzo form, typically the 3rd movement of many classical symphonies, sometimes the 2nd movement, notably Beethoven's 9th Symphony, the scherzo is the 2nd movement, but it's typically one of the inner movements will be in this form. Now, for something new, the next form we're going to discuss is rondo form. Rondo form sort of builds off of what we saw in ternary form. If you look at the letters at the bottom of your screen, you see the first 3 are A, B, A, just like ternary form. But rondo form is going to expand upon this. Instead of just having A, B, A, now we can have a C section, or even D, E, F, and so on and so forth. The only thing here, the main thing that is going to distinguish rondo form is that however many sections we have, the A theme will always come back between each new section. So you have here A, B, A, C, A. It could go on. D, A, E, A. You could even go back to one you've already visited. C, A, B, A in reverse, something like that. The only thing that is important here is that A always appears between each of the contrasting sections. Couple of examples of ABACA rondo form, one of the most common rondos. For Elise and the Pathetique Sonata 2nd movement, both by Beethoven, also Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, his Symphony number 3, the 2nd movement, and Mozart's Piano Concerto number 20 in D minor. All 4 of these pieces follow the ABACA rondo form, and I'm going to share these links with you in the chat in case you would like to listen to some examples of this form. But we are going to look together at For Elise by Beethoven, a beloved piece of music for solo piano that almost all, if not every single piano student plays at some point in their youth. For Elise is a straightforward ABACA rondo. We have our A section, a famous melody everybody knows. A section everybody knows in the key of A minor. We have a contrasting B section in the key of F major. A will then return, and then we have another contrasting C section that is very dark and stormy. And finally, at the end, a simple return of the A section. So we're going to listen together to Für Elise by Beethoven, and you'll listen to an example of an ABACA rondo. Here we go. Have the sheet music up for those of you who read. Notice that the A section within itself is an ABA form, a little ABA. Here's the B section of the A, just like in the scherzo. And back to the little A section. Repeat of the little B section. And back to the A section. Now here's the big B section of the rondo, F major. Totally different. Back to the A section. Here's the C section, dark and stormy. Back to the last A section. So there you have it. Basic ABACA rondo form in one of the most famous and most beloved pieces in the piano repertoire, particularly for beginning piano students. Now, we're going to spend the rest, any questions about the rondo form, first of all? Great. Okay, we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about the most important form in all of classical music and all of Western art music, the Sonata-Allegro form. Most commonly used form, as I mentioned, classical and romantic periods. I said before that basically you can apply what you've learned in this class to anything from the classical period, Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn, music of their contemporaries. Sonata-Allegro form, you can at least apply the basic principles of this to the Romantic period and even into the 20th century as well. Almost every first movement of every symphony until those of Mahler and Bruckner was written in this form, and many, many others after that time as well. Lots of slow movements and finales also employ this form. You may have heard the word sonata thrown around in various different contexts. Typically, if you hear a piece called piano sonata or sonata for violin and piano or something like that, if it's a solo work or a work for two instruments, the composer used the word sonata as the title. Typically after that, if you get to 3 or more instruments, instead of using the word sonata, they'll use the word trio, quartet, quintet, and so on, all the way up to when we get to symphony, a piece written for the whole orchestra. Really, the only difference between these terms is the orchestration of the piece. Whether it's called a sonata or it's labeled by the ensemble playing it, most of the time, the first movement and some of the other movements of these works are going to be in Sonata-Allegro form. So sonatas as pieces are slightly different from Sonata-Allegro form. A sonata written for a solo instrument is a multi-movement work, some of the movements of which could be in Sonata-Allegro form. So here's Sonata-Allegro form. Here's how it works. There are 5 sections that I'm going to talk about that you can see in a sonata. The only ones that you're basically going to see in every single sonata ever written are 2 of them. The exposition. This is where we expose the themes. We introduce the main themes of the movement. Thus, exposition, exposing the themes. And then the recapitulation, where we recapitulate or bring back, present again the themes that we heard in the exposition. And as you will see, we're not just going to do that exactly as we heard them before. We're going to change a few things. Otherwise, it would be basically the same as ternary form, and sonatas are generally of a length that if you heard the exact same thing in the recapitulation, wouldn't be as interesting. If you have an exposition and a recapitulation, and I will get into what those entail, you have a piece in Sonata-Allegro form. Now, those are the bare minimum requirements. Going further, adding the rest of the sections, you may or may not have some or all of these. Common ones to have in addition: the development. Most pieces in Sonata-Allegro form have a development. This is where the composer takes the themes that he or she exposed in the exposition and develops them, changes, alters, mutates, or otherwise has fun with the themes that they came up with in the exposition. The development section goes between the exposition and the recapitulation. You're introduced to the themes in the exposition. The composer plays around with them, has fun with them to hopefully the audience's delight and amusement, and then brings them back sort of in their original form, but changed a little bit. Another section we can have in the Sonata-Allegro form is the Coda. This section comes after the work of the recapitulation is over and really just serves to reiterate the tonic key and bring the movement to a satisfactory conclusion. If you hear a piece that ends with one of these big if you hear a piece that ends with that, it's probably the Coda, because you wouldn't want to end the exposition that way because the audience would think the piece was over. Now, you might have a little bit of that. Obviously, you want to come to a conclusion of the section, but if you hear one of those huge over-the-top endings, it's probably in the Coda. An example, by the way, of a sonata that has an exposition, recapitulation, and a Coda, but doesn't have a development, is the wonderful Overture to the Marriage of Figaro by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Does not have a development. The last part, and part isn't technically part of the Sonata-Allegro form, but you see it frequently in movements that are in Sonata-Allegro form, and that is the introduction. This comes before the exposition. Only some sonatas include it. It's usually brief, slower tempo than the main body of the sonata. Frequently, you're going to hear it only at the beginning of the first movement of a symphony or other large multi-movement work. Sometimes at the beginning of the fourth movement as well, but really it's a first movement thing. Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven all had introductions. Everyone used this basic form or parts of it. But again, exposition and recapitulation you must have in order for it to be a sonata. Development you usually have. Coda you sometimes have. And introduction less frequently, typically at the beginning of the first movement. So, the different parts of the sonata. The exposition has its own subsections. The primary area is the first thing that happens, and it's where the first theme or themes are presented in the tonic key of the piece. Often it's just one theme, but it could be more than one. The main thing that distinguishes the primary area is it's in the home key. It's in the key of the piece. After that, we have the secondary area. Secondary area is where we're going to have the second theme or themes, but these are going to be presented in a different key. And frequently, if the piece is in a major key, it is going to be presented in the key of 5. So if it's in the key of C major, typically the secondary area is going to be in the key of G major. And if it's a piece in a minor key, it's typically going to be presented in the key of 3, which, as you may remember, is the relative major of a minor key. It's the key that has the same key signature. So, for instance, A minor, which has no sharps or flats, the third scale degree is C, C major. So, oftentimes, if a piece is in A minor, for the primary area, the secondary area is going to appear in the key of 3, the relative major, C major. Notable exception to these rules, Beethoven's triple concerto for violin, cello, and piano actually sort of turns the minor key secondary area on its head. The piece is in C major, but instead of the secondary area in G major, it's actually in A minor, in the relative minor, which is unusual. And quite honestly, when I first heard the piece, I thought, this is brilliant. Why don't more people do it? But it's a rare, rare occasion that Beethoven did. So we have a primary area in the home key. We have a secondary area in some other key. And somehow we have to get there smoothly, get between keys smoothly. And this is where we have the transition. Transition features a common chord modulation somewhere within it, which gets us from the key of the primary area to the key of the secondary area. You can usually identify the start of the transition because it'll start on a new phrase. Or for those who read music, you find where a common chord modulation happens, work backwards till you see a nice, satisfactory beginning of a phrase. That's usually where the transition starts. At the end of the transition, we have something called the medial caesura. And this is sort of a little rest or lift or decrescendo or something that gives us sort of just a little breather before we are introduced to the secondary area. And that is the point that marks the barrier between the transition and the secondary area. So the transition has been establishing our new key, and then it'll stop for a second, and then we got our secondary area. After the secondary area, we have our closing section, which will help to reiterate the key we have arrived in, usually 5 for a piece in a major key, or 3 for a piece in a minor key, and brings the exposition to a convincing close. The place where the closing starts, that marks the barrier between the secondary area and the closing, is called the essential expositional closure, a long mouthful to describe an authentic cadence that brings the secondary area to an end and begins the closing section. We all remember an authentic cadence, 5 going to 1. You'll see one of those at the end of the secondary area, which kicks off the closing. So that's the exposition. Primary area, transition, secondary area, closing, with the medial caesura and essential expositional closure, or EEC for short, marking the barriers between those sections. Now, we're next going to look at the recapitulation, because, as you might expect, the recapitulation is going to look very, very similar to the structure of the exposition. It begins, as you would expect, with the primary area, which is going to do exactly what it did in the exposition. It presents, once again, the first theme or themes in the tonic key of the piece. Then we have the transition, once again, but the transition is going to have a slightly different function this time. It is rewritten to remove the common chord modulation and keep the piece in the tonic key. The biggest difference between the exposition and recapitulation is that the recapitulation does not modulate. It's at the end of the piece, and we have to stay with our key and keep it established. So, to show this, there are some differences in the transition between the two sections. The first we call the end of correspondence measures. This is the place where the primary area is going along exactly like it did in the exposition. The transition's going along exactly like it did in the exposition. But, of course, we have to take out the common chord modulation. So we have to, at some point, break from what we were doing before so we don't modulate. And the moment that the music stops being the same, we call the end of correspondence measures. Then, at some point, because we're going to have the rest of the sections, the secondary area and so on, but they're going to be in the tonic key, at some point we have to get back to where we were, except transpose to the tonic key. And the moment where that happens, we call the crux. The crux is the point where the material of the exposition starts appearing exactly as it did before, except in the tonic key instead of 5 or 3 or some other key. We still have the medial caesura, and by this point, of course, we are past the crux, and it's exactly like it was in the exposition, except transposed. We then have the secondary area. The themes will be the same, but as I mentioned, we're going to be in the tonic key instead of in the dominant, or in 5 or 3. Now, if you have major keys, usually you're just going to take whatever you had before in 5, in the key of 5, and transpose it to 1. Minor keys, it gets more interesting, because sometimes composers would take the major key material from the exposition and present it in the major key of the tonic. You get this, for instance, in Beethoven's 5th Symphony. The secondary area is presented in E flat major in scale degree 3. Like that. And then in the recapitulation, C major just transposes it directly as is. Like that. The other option composers have, and this is my personal favorite, and it sort of fell out of fashion after Beethoven. Beethoven was the one who started directly transposing his major key exposition themes in a minor key piece into a major key secondary area in the recapitulation. before that, composers would often rewrite the theme altogether so that it was major in the exposition and minor in the recapitulation. You can find this, for instance, in Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 20. You get this theme in the exposition. Like that. And then the recapitulation, he changes it around so it's in D minor. It's a lovely effect, hearing the same theme except not quite the same, because it goes from major to minor. After the secondary area is over, instead of the essential expositional closure, because we're at the end of the recapitulation and at the end almost of the whole piece, we have what we call the essential sonata closure. And at this point, it is the authentic cadence that brings the entire harmonic argument of the movement to an end. Everything else that happens after this is simply going to reiterate the tonic. After that, we have the closing, which does the same thing it did before, reiterates the tonic, may bring the piece to a close by itself, or it could lead to the coda. So that's the recapitulation. These are the most important sections of the sonata: exposition, recapitulation. That was a lot of information. That was a lot of words. If there are any questions now, I'm happy to take them. Hopefully, it will also become a little bit clearer in a moment when we listen to a piece of music in sonata form. But if there are any questions about this for now, I'm glad to take them. Okay, we'll keep plowing forward. Now, next section we're going to talk about is the development. As I mentioned, composers develop the material that they wrote in the exposition, that they presented in the exposition, and play around with it, have fun with it. Developments can be divided into subsections based on the themes being developed, or sometimes harmonic decisions made by the composer. The reason music theory is called music theory is that there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer when you're analyzing a piece. And subsections of a development section are one of those things. I might have one opinion on how many subsections there are or where they are, but someone else might have a different opinion, and both of us might be able to make a convincing argument. This is all higher level stuff when you're actually presenting a music theory paper at a conference somewhere. But anyway, development sections, think about if you have the primary area, there are going to be one or more themes, secondary area, one or more themes, and the composer can sort of weave in and out of them, put them in different keys, take one that was in major and put it in minor, just have all sorts of fun with the material that they've already written. The last subsection of the development is called the retransition, which is going to harmonically get us back to the tonic to prepare us for the recapitulation. And the harmonic goal of the development is the final harmony that is reached in the development before the recapitulation. Typically, as you would probably expect, this is going to be 5, because the most common progression, 5 going to 1 at the very end of our flow chart, that is what we're going to most often hear, because it's what we most want to hear. It's what our ears would be most satisfied by. Not every composer did this. 2 famous examples: Beethoven's first 2 symphonies, the first movements. The first symphony is in C major, so you would expect that the harmonic goal of the development would probably be G major, or maybe G dominant 7, something that will set up C major. Actually, it's E major, a chord that is not even diatonic to the key of C major. One of the reasons Beethoven changed the world of music forever, he was not afraid to break rules and do things that had never been done before. Beethoven's second symphony in the key of D major, you'd expect A major, the 5 chord of D major, to set up the recapitulation. It's actually C sharp major, not even C sharp diminished, which also could have made sense because 7 diminished can go to 1. No, C sharp major, another instance where a harmonical not even in the key of the piece. Typically, though, we're going to see a 5 chord, maybe a 7 diminished chord to set up the recapitulation in the tonic. The coda, the last section of the Sonata-Allegro form, reiterates the tonic chord. All of our harmonic journey that we've been on, the harmonic arc, is over at this point, and the coda just helps to say, here's where we are, we started here, we ended here, hooray. That's the major point of the coda. The difference between the closing section of the recapitulation and the coda is that the closing of the recapitulation is music that you will have heard before, because the exposition has a closing, and the closing of the recapitulation is going to be like, or either exactly like or almost exactly like the closing of the exposition. The coda is going to be music that you have not heard before. So the closing ends, and sometimes the piece might just end at that point. Or if you hear something brand new that you had not heard before, that is the closing section. Excuse me, that is the coda. Codas can be of various lengths. Eine Kleine Nachtmusik by Mozart, which we're going to look at in depth momentarily. The coda is only 6 measures long. Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the first movement, I've always found this so fascinating. He has 4 sections: exposition, development, recapitulation, and coda. They are all almost exactly the same amount of measures. Exposition and development, both the same at 124 measures. Recapitulation just a little bit longer at 126. The coda, shockingly, the longest section of them all at 128 measures, but they are almost all the same amount of measures. Highly unusual. Again, brilliance of Beethoven, but highly, highly unusual. You'll see that, but it's possible. Finally, the introduction, slow section which precedes the exposition, as I mentioned, usually only used in the first movement, if it's used at all. Even in the classical period, it was not always used. In the symphonies of Mozart and Haydn, the introduction rarely had anything to do with the rest of the piece. It sort of just was like, all right, sit down, take your seats, get your ears ready, here's what the tonic key sounds like. Beethoven, again, brilliance of Beethoven, used the introduction to introduce the Easter eggs of the piece. Of Beethoven's 9 symphonies, only 4 have introductions: the first, the second, the fourth, and the 7th. And he uses them to introduce things that on first listening in the introduction, you're like, huh, I thought this piece was in A major. What is the key of F major doing here and so early in the piece? Well, F major keeps creeping up. In this case, talking about Beethoven's 7th symphony, symphony number 7, A major. For the rest of the piece, A major continues to creep up. Another great example, Camille Saint-Saëns Organ Symphony, which I had the wonderful joy and pleasure to conduct at the Canton Symphony back in January. The piece is in the key of C minor. It begins on a D flat major chord, a half step above the tonic, but the key of D flat major keeps on appearing in the least expected places. So Easter eggs, little things that seem a little bit off, that they don't really belong. If a piece is going to have them, oftentimes you will hear them introduced in the slow introduction. So we're going to look at a piece of music in Sonata-Allegro form. This is Mozart's Eine Kleine Nachtmusik, wonderfully beloved and famous piece of classical music that I'm sure all of you know, and if not, you will know it in a moment. I have a score up for those of you who read music. If you don't, hopefully you'll still be able to hear everything we're talking about. So, Eine Kleine Nachtmusik, first movement, This piece does not have an introduction. We start right away with the primary area. We're in the key of G major, as you see, 1 sharp. Father Charles goes down and ends battle. We just have Father. We're in the key of G major. So I'm going to play it through. I'm going to stop at the beginning of each section so we can talk about it. The exposition will be repeated. So the second time, I'm just going to let it play through, and you'll be able to hear. I'll call out the sections, but you'll be able to hear how they flow together. We start, of course, with the primary area, and it is in the key of G major. That's the primary area. The next thing you will hear is going to be the transition. Transition is going to begin in G major, but by the end of it, we're going to be in the key of D major, and we're going to look at how that happens. That is the transition. We started in G major, we ended in D major. Let's take a quick look at how we got there. This is the beginning of the transition right here at the left side of the page. We're in the key of G. Still in the key of G, still in the key of G. You can even see, for those of you who read music, you can even see in the cellos and basses, which are both written on this bottom staff here in bass clef, the cellos and basses just hold the note G for a very long time. The first time they move in the transition is this note here. This is simply a 5-chord in first inversion, a D major triad, but as you would expect, it goes back to G, 5 going to 1, D going to G. The next chord is the chord where we get our first accidental. We have a C sharp. C sharp is the note that is in the key signature of D major, but not in the key signature of G major. So we look at the notes of this chord, we have C sharp, G, E. This is a C sharp diminished triad. This is not a diatonic chord in the key of G, but it is 7 diminished in the key of D. So at this point, it looks like we've probably already modulated by common chord, hopefully by common chord modulation. If this is going to be 7 in the key of D, how did we get there? The chord before was a 1 chord, a G major chord, but G major is also the 4 chord in the key of D. So we can analyze that as 4, and 4 can go to 7, which then on the next page of the score will go to 1. So that right there is our common chord modulation that we were expecting to see in the transition to get us from the key of G to the key of D, where we will have our secondary area. Once again, the transition. Still in the key of G. Here's our modulation. And now we're in D on the 1 chord. This part establishes that as the 1. And that moment right there, bum, 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 that is our medial caesura, as we talked about. You see there's a rest here. The entire orchestra lifts. That's our slight break before we get our secondary area. So, of course, the next thing we expect to hear is the secondary area. theme is repeated. And now we get a new theme altogether. This new theme is repeated now. Right where we arrived is the EEC, the essential expositional closure, which brings the secondary area to a close. Now, if you noticed, the secondary area had two themes. The first one, ba-ba-dum, bum, 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 ta-ba-dum, bum, ba-dum. And the second one, ba-ba-da-da-da-dum, bum, 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 ba-dum. They're both in the key of D major. They're both part of the secondary area. We can label them, if we want, S1 for the first theme of the secondary area, and S2 for the second theme. Right here, this moment is our EEC. You see, A goes to D, 5 goes to 1. It's an authentic cadence, and it ends the secondary area and takes us into the closing section. So here's the closing. And as I mentioned, most classical sonatas, many romantic sonatas as well, repeat the exposition. Composer wants to make sure that if he or she is going to develop the themes, that you really have them in your ear. So you're going to get all of them presented. Once again, I'm going to let it play through. I'm just going to call out the various moments that occur in the piece. But you'll see how it all flows together. So starting, of course, with the primary area. Here's the transition. Here's the modulation. The medial caesura and the secondary area, S1, the first theme. Here's S2, the second theme. Here's a repeat of S2. It's the EEC and the closing. That is the end of the second iteration of the exposition. We now move on to the development section. You're going to hear three sections, three subsections of the development. The first one is very short, 4 measures long. In it, you will hear the first theme, the primary area, played in the key of the secondary area, played in 5. So the theme of the primary area played in the key of the secondary area. That's it, 4 measures. Now we're going to hear the S2 theme played in C major, which is in the original key, it is our 4 chord, G, A, B, C. Not an unexpected place for the development to go. However, look as it continues at how Mozart brings in some notes that are not in the key. You see right away here we have F natural instead of F sharp. And then a little bit later, we're also going to have E flat, very unexpected note. So watch for that. Here is the second subsection of the development, S2 in C major. Here's a G sharp. Here's a B flat. Here's E flat. And right where we just arrived, the third measure that you see on your screen, this is going to be the beginning of the third and last subsection, which, as you may recall, we call the retransition. It's also, if you look at the chord that we have here, this is the moment we're talking about. Beginning of our retransition, if you look at our chord, D, F sharp, A, D. It's a D major triad, and D is 5 in the key of G. This is also our harmonic goal of the development. And this is going to help us launch us back to the recapitulation. So here is the third subsection, or the retransition. And that cadence brings us back to the recapitulation. I'm going to just play one more time the development all the way through, and we're going to proceed straight into the recapitulation. Here's the development once again. First subsection. Second subsection. Here's the harmonic goal and the retransition. Here's the primary area of the recapitulation. So the primary area of the recapitulation appeared exactly as it appeared, note for note, in the exposition. We just got to the beginning of the transition, and now we're going to expect Mozart to stay in the key of G and not modulate to the key of D this time. So let's see how he does it. That is our transition. As you may realize, it is a lot shorter than it was in the exposition. So we're going to go back to the beginning of the transition, take a look at what he does here. So far, everything's the same, including the fact that we still have this C sharp. But we don't have to analyze that as a modulation. We could simply call it a secondary seventh chord, as you probably remember. In this case, if we do that instead of the modulation, we simply have 7 diminished of 5. And in that case, this D chord, instead of being 1, is going to be 5. We're analyzing this way because we know, using knowledge that we have about sonata form, we know that the transition of the recapitulation is not going to modulate. So we analyze it this way instead. So we have our 7 diminished of 5 going to 5, and then this C sharp is part of an A dominant 7th chord with a D in the bass, but don't worry too much about that. And that A dominant 7th is just going to be used to prolong the 5 chord. We arrive at the 5 chord with this 7 diminished of 5, and then this 5, 7 of 5 is just going to be used to prolong it. Now, what happens on the next page here? This second measure, this is what we call our end of correspondence measures. It is the only measure of the transition that he literally had to rewrite. It's new music that he wrote specifically for the transition of the recapitulation to keep us in the key of G. Just this measure, because the next measure, the measure that has the medial caesura in it, as you can see with our rest at the end, that measure is exactly like the medial caesura in the exposition, except that it's transposed down a fifth. So that instead of being in the key of D, in the key of 5, we transpose it down a fifth so that it's in the key of 1, in the key of G. That is the crux. From here on out, we expect that the rest of the piece is going to be just like, or almost just like, the exposition, except that it's going to be in the key of G rather than the key of D. So we have one measure that does not correspond, and then we have the crux. Here's the secondary area, S1, in the key of G. Here's S2. Repeat of S2. He jumps the octave here to make it more exciting. Right there where we just arrived is our essential sonata closure, the cadence that ends the entire harmonic argument of the sonata form. And from there, we move on to our closing section. Closing section, you're going to notice, is a little bit longer than it was in the exposition. He takes the material of the closing and just expands it a little. What I find so interesting about this, in this particular piece, the exposition is 55 measures long. The recapitulation is also 55 measures long. As we saw, he took out several measures of the transition. So to make up for it, he adds a few in the closing. Composers don't have to do that. Maybe he didn't mean to do it, but it's Mozart. He was a genius. I'm sure he knew exactly what he was doing, and he's like, no one's going to realize these are the exact same amount of measures, but it's a cool thing nonetheless. So here's the closing section, a little bit longer than it was in the exposition. I hate to end right on a big 5 chord, but the following section is the Coda, which will reiterate that we're in G major and bring us to a nice flourish of a finish. There you have it. I know we're right at 7 o'clock now. if everybody has just a few minutes to stick around, I'd love to just play for you once again the recapitulation in Coda, just so you can hear how it all flows together. So really quickly, it's only a couple minutes long. I will play for you the recapitulation. It's not even 2 minutes long. Here we go. Primary area. Here's the transition. Here's the end of correspondence and the crux, medial caesura. Secondary area, S1. Here's S2. ESC, closing. Coda. And with that flourish of a finish, I am pleased to say that thus ends the lesson. Thus ends the course. I hope all of you enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun. I had a blast, quite honestly. And we are going to figure out trying to continue something for those of you who are interested and actually analyzing pieces together as a group. Should be a lot of fun. But really, I had a wonderful time doing this with all of you this summer. I hope you had a good time as well. And if you have any last questions, I can take them. Otherwise, we'll call it a course. Call it a summer.
Yeah. Abigail did have a question about, Abigail, I wanted, maybe if you're comfortable turning on your camera and your microphone, I'm not exactly sure what you were asking about. So if you want to say it verbally for Matthew.
Sure, that'd be better. I wasn't quite sure how to put it down and listen to music at the same time. Like, ah. So I was wondering how you know when it's a different theme. Like you have theme 1 and theme 2, you said. Well, how do you know that theme 2 isn't theme 1? Like isn't part of theme 1?
So, okay, so then we, in our 6-week discovery, in our 6-week discovery of music theory, there were some things that I had to leave out. But really, it comes down to that in S2, that's a phrase, and then we have, that is what we would call in, I don't want to get into all this, it's going to open another can of worms, but suffice it to say, we have that phrase, we have another phrase that's similar. It ends with a perfect authentic cadence. And then we have something that's in the same key, but sounds unrelated. And in and of itself is additionally other phrases. The fact that the phrase structure, there's a solid theme that ends on a perfect authentic cadence. There's another solid theme that ends on a perfect authentic cadence. That is sort of how we can tell. Whereas in the first theme, in the primary area, it was all sort of continuous. It wasn't the same sort of segmented phrase structure as you had.
Okay.
But again, I will say, it's like I said with the development and subsections. Music theorists can write papers about why there isn't an S2, and others will say, well, there is actually, and they'll argue about it at conferences. It's that type of thing. It's the analysis of full pieces, formal analysis, is one of the most wonderfully and widely debated topics in music theory.
Okay, thank you.
You are welcome.
Awesome. I'm not sure. I don't think we have any other questions, so I'm going to go ahead and
Okay, really quickly, I'm going to share something with everybody, which I put together today, and it is a PDF file of the sonata structure of Eine, Kleine, Nachtmusik. I have it both by the measure number of when everything happens, as well as the time code in the recording we just heard when everything happens. So you can actually see, you can follow along on this sheet and see the blow-by-blow account of when every event of the sonata occurred.
I'll make sure to send that out with the email to everyone afterwards as well.
Yes, and it has a link to the YouTube, so you'll be able to find it easily.
So if you can't get it, download it right now, you'll get it in an email a couple of days from now when we get the video ready. So, all right, I think that was it for questions. So thank you so much for joining us this summer. It was a lot of fun, and yeah, I think that's where we'll end it.
All right, great, guys. It was a pleasure. It was a blast.